Thomas Dolby was never simply a pop star. He was one of the great architects of the electronic age in music, a producer, composer, sonic experimenter who helped shape the sound of the 80s, while also anticipating many aspects of the world we now live in. From pioneering synthesizer technology and creating landmark albums such as The Golden Age of Wireless and The Flat Earth, to collaborating with artists including Stevie Wonder, Joni Mitchell, and Prefab Sprout, Dolby consistently approached music as both emotional storytelling and technological exploration. I talked to him on the eve of his iconic 80s Recollections tour. So, Thomas Dolby, welcome. I want to start with something which is what I really believe about you, is that you sort of spent your life at this intersection of music, technology, and imagination. And I just wondered, on the eve of this tour, when you look back, do you think you were predicting the future or were you escaping the present?
More like escaping the present, I think. I mean, people that predict the future, it's usually to try and affect the outcome. And I was not trying to affect the outcome, really. I was just always rather fascinated with, well, what if, steam had supplanted silicon, and what if the Nazi invasion had succeeded and we were under German occupation, and what if, a meteorite hit the planet and, and everything changed for us. And so I was always just sort of imagining alternative scenarios, sort of dystopian worlds, and what my role would be in those worlds. I not really predict. I don't consider myself a futurist, really. I mean, when new technologies would come along, I was always fascinated to dive in and try them out and see what I could use them for. Often purposes that had never been intended, really, by the designers. And so I've just always had this sort of fascination with new tools and how to use and abuse them.
Yeah, and also you've always pushed the limits of the technology you've had, haven't you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I see possibilities in technology that were not foreseen. And often I'll go back to the designers and say, hey, look what I did with your machine or your toy. And if I'm fortunate, they would listen to me, and the next revision they did would include my suggestions.
With that in mind, though, with the idea of this intersection that I mentioned, the tour has the help of AI, a digitally sampled orchestra, and you've got a virtual orchestra behind it, I suppose. Well, not behind it, but you've got a virtual orchestra on stage, and you've got a band made up of real musicians. So,
indeed, yeah.
When you're doing a show which is an 80s recollections, it's something that has really twisted that whole thing on its head. So why did you come up with that idea, and why did you choose the musicians that you're working with? Because they're also, a couple of them are a cross-section of people that you've worked with in your life.
As you probably know, I've been teaching at the Peabody Conservatory for the last 10 or 11 years. And when I finish my classes, I often stop in at orchestra rehearsals. And, after hours of twiddling knobs and pushing faders, I listen to these kids that are world-class, musicians that have been doing it since they were toddlers. And when they're really on, there's this resonance that happens where, there's not only a sort of neural link between the tips of their fingers and their brains, but also, the open strings, the sound of their neighbors, the open piano lid, the timpanis that are ringing a bit, the sound from the back of the hall or under the stage. And when it's really all in tune, it's something that doesn't happen with machines, because machines don't really listen to each other. They have no sense of the context that they're in. You build sound like Lego blocks, and you stack them, but they have no consciousness per se. And what I find fascinating about an orchestra is that they move as one, sort of like a school of fish or a flock of birds. And I find that, extremely intriguing, because technology, so far at any rate, is not able to assimilate that. So it's sort of like the last frontier that has not been touched by AI or any other technology.
Then why did you want to use AI in this setup?
Because in the composition of it, I wanted to mash together uh, dozens, if not hundreds, of influences and sort of quotes and points of reference from my journey through the 80s. Um, some of which are my, personal recollections, or some of which are observing what was going on in England and in the world. And when you were there, which I think you and I were, it was quite a dark decade, but it's remembered these days by younger people and by the sort of retro rewind circuit for the fluff, the day glow, the walking on sunshine, and the girls just want to have fun, and that's great to take a walk down memory lane. But actually thinking back to what it felt like to be young in that time, it was quite a dissociative sort of lonely time, really, and scary stuff, at the time, the Cold War and corporate greed and the miners' strike and Thatcher and all the rest of it. And by today's standards, it's quite innocent, quite naive, really. But when we were there, it was quite scary. So I'm sort of leaning into that, because I think that a lot of that feeling was reflected in the music of the decade, but in the music of the Cure and the Smiths and Susie and the Banshees and people like that, and rather than the fluffy stuff.
It's really interesting you say that because I've always said, and a lot of people that I've interviewed have talked about the 80s in the terms that you've just mentioned it. And I've always thought it was a disaster. I mean, I was a gay kid in the 80s in a homophobic, misogynistic, racist, Thatcher era. And my
Right.
escape during that era, though, was music of all different types, but it was music. That was my world, my sort of
Mm-hmm.
architecture. So in terms of this idea that music is architecture, was it that for you? Was it also a protection in the 80s from the environment around you?
Well, it certainly was, and it was it's the ultimate protection for me, really, because I was quite a shy sort of wallflower kid and socially quite anxious. And within the space of about 6 months, I went from being the wallflower to being the center of attention. And but what was the center of attention was a slightly fabricated persona, that I sort of created for the MTV era of the synth boffin, and behind the little round glasses. And so when I walked into a room, the crowd would part, and what they were seeing was a sort of hologram of the MTV character. So it really did feel like a fishbowl to me, and it went from one form of disassociation to another, really. But yes, it was certainly a sort of armor. The music that I created was very escapist, and it was an armor for me to get away from that social anxiety, but also to sort of insulate me against some of what felt like the horrors of the decade.
That change of name also eventually led to a change of character, didn't it? It was like you you change your name to Thomas Dolby, and then you create a character around that. But was that character related in any way? Because many people that I've interviewed, when you look at their history in terms of their childhood, and this is me included, there is some form of wound in their childhood which has sort of sown the seeds of what they were going to do later.
Yeah, I'm not sure there was a terrible wound. I mean, I was quite a happy child, but very insular, and it only came to the crunch when I was sort of wanting to meet, girls, uh, and wanting to make my way in the world, and aware that I had a musical gift that needed to get heard. And so this sort of exhibitionist streak emerged, a small percentage of my personality. But I think a lot of performers are like that. They're sort of mainly hermits who have this streak of exhibitionism that comes to life when they go on stage. And I'm definitely one of those.
Do you think MTV ruined music in the 80s?
Oh no, far from it. I think it actually inspired a huge amount of diversity. The reason being that if you had a cool video and you got on MTV, you would then get radio play, and you could have a hit record, versus absent MTV, you had the formatting, sort of the pigeonholing of music formats on radio. And this is more in the USA than here, because on BBC Radio 1 and 2, you would get, a ballad after a folk song, after a dance hit. But in the States, it was very fragmented, and it was very hard to break through those genres. And when I first appeared, I suffered from the fact that some radio stations were sort of allergic to anything electronic. They felt that their listeners would think this was not real music. And then on top of that, I was getting played in urban dance clubs. And so that crossed over certain lines that they didn't like to cross. MTV came along and my video got in rotation, and MTV was so powerful in the early days that radio stations had to follow their playlists. And so I automatically got lots of play. And I think it was true also of many of the artists that sort of really embraced the video genre, like Talking Heads and Peter Gabriel, Kate Bush, Laurie Anderson, and so on, who were able to get away with doing really quite daring sounding records. As long as they had a great video that caught on, then it would eventually lead to radio play.
Magnus Pyke, who was in Blinded Me with Science, he was my first interviewee when I was at journalism school. And I went round his house, and he had about 300 clocks in his front room. And I interviewed him at 10 to 12, and at 12 o'clock, all the clocks went off.
Oh, no, it must have sounded like Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah, it did. I mean, I got back and I couldn't really edit it, but it was an amazing experience. And based on you and that song, obviously. Let's get to the musicians that you're going to be working with. A couple of them we've worked with, well, three of them we've worked with in the past. So Jacko, Matt Hector, and also you're working with Martin McAloon.
Well, so Martin's coming on the tour as support, which is great. And he has toured with me before. And obviously I've known him for decades. So that's great to have him along. And Martin is amazing live. He's like a sort of stand-up comedian whose hook is that, he used to be in a pop group and his brother is a musical treasure, So, and then Matt Hector has drums with me on and off over the years. He's been on a couple of records and I've done multiple tours with him. So it's great to have him back. Jacko, I've never played with before this tour, and a few one-off things, but I have played football with him in the park way back when. And then so I need like multiple musicians in each role, because when I do this with an orchestra, it won't really be a tour per se. It'll be a weekend here and there, jumping around between different cities. And I can't retain the musicians and have them be on call for all of those. So I need to have alternates for each of the musicians. So in the States, I had Gail Ann Dorsey, who's David Bowie's bass player for the last 15, 20 years. Of his life, and she's a wonderful alto singer and bass player. But over here, my bass player is actually a TikTok phenom that I discovered. She showed up in my feed one day, and she was one of these pyrotechnic TikTok musicians that I was really blown away with. But when I talked to her, she had a really interesting story. This is Anna Shakina. She fled Ukraine with her husband when the war started, and wound up in Lisbon, Portugal, and started making these TikTok and Instagram videos, just her grooving along to other songs and singing. She's an amazing singer. And I got in contact with her and asked her if she would do this. And as far as I know, she's never played anything bigger than about a cafe. So it'd be interesting to see how she does, in larger venues, and also how she does on a tour bus with 8 guys. We'll see.
I mean, that combination, it sort of mirrors also this balance that you've had in your life between the sort of, let's call it classical songwriting, as it were, and the future-facing technology. It seems to be, even in the choice of people, you're going along the same lines.
Yeah. I mean, I like stuff that's fresh. It inspires me to stretch out and try things differently. Some of the best ideas come from hurdles and roadblocks that you hit along the way, and being forced to come up with creative solutions for them. And this is something of a lost art, really, because these days, your impulse when you hit a roadblock is to, with a few finger taps, you can get the solution. But the downside is that 10,000 other guys came up with that same exact result, same exact solution at the same moment around the world. So it tends to homogenize everything if that's the way people solve problems. So, for example, with my students, I have them turn off their machines. I lock them in a room and I say, right, you've got 20 minutes. And I give them a prompt to write a piece of music. And at the end, they have to all play it to the class. But I give them very few ingredients. They're not allowed to use their, sample libraries and so on. I just give them a couple of synths to use, and they have to figure out, a clever way to get it done. Rather like if MacGyver, would always be, you'd be locked in a room with like a carrot and a piece of copper wire, and he had to figure out the way to get out. So they have to MacGyver their way out of a problem.
So is that in a sense, by teaching your students that technique, it's exactly what you've had to have done in your life. You've had to solve a problem with the minimal of equipment, let's say.
Well, I mean, yes, although the equipment was very often sort of cutting edge and very rarefied. And there wasn't a manual or a forum you could go on to, ask how to do it. So I would just sort of dive in and mess around until I found something good. And often, you make an accidental left turn and you stumble on something amazing. So you have to be an explorer and a sort of a judge at the same time, or an editor at the same time. You have to be willing to boldly go, but then you have to be open to ideas that maybe was not what you intended, and know when to fold them into the whole, whether it's a sound or a lyrical idea or a video idea, whatever it may be. You just have to keep an open mind.
It's funny you mentioned Martin McAloon, because he told me that when he was supporting you on tour and there was a rehearsal, he was forgetting his words, and he was, having a bit of problem on stage, and you were sitting in the audience, you were sitting at the front eating a pizza, and you were on your phone. And he was terrified of how you were going to react, and didn't even realize that actually you were taking all that in at the same time. And then went up to him and said, Martin, all you have to do is slow it down and be calm. And that really helped him.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose that's a producer in me, really. I mean, the McAloon brothers are just amazing, and Paddy was forever, worried that his timing and his tuning were off or whatever, and I'd make a suggestion, he'd go, "Oh, okay, Thomas." They were very trusting, bless them, and that's how I got away with what I got away with, on their records.
I mean, you met them in the small village, didn't you? Paddy told me that he stayed downstairs, and you went up. Sorry, Martin told me you stayed downstairs and you went up to Paddy's room and started, whatever you were doing with the music at that point.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't really room in Paddy's room for more than two people. In fact, his bed was a single mattress built on a stack of lyrics from the hundreds of songs he's written over the years. And he didn't write chord charts. He just would write like E, A, B flat over the lyrics. And so when I went up to his room with him, he pulled out a stack of them and he would just strum on his guitar, and it played me like, I don't know, 70 or 80 songs, I would think, and I'd say next, and I just picked out the ones that I liked, and that became the set list for the album.
I mean, this latest tour, it's sort of a development between the time capsule era, then the autobiography, The Speed of Sound, and now we've got the iconic 80s Reflections. And it's somewhat of all of that process feels very autobiographical. I mean, some directly, obviously, but it all feels very autobiographical. What are you learning about yourself? Because when you write about your history, you uncover things that you didn't realize that happened, or things about yourself. So I just wondered if that process is a very comfortable process, or it's something that has really highlighted things that have, you've gone, oh wow, I didn't realize that about me in the past.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some sort of navel gazing going on. But I think also, there's so much nostalgia. There's so much of a nostalgia industry around, and there's so much looking to the past, looking for something more sort of authentic, in the past. I think from people that are underwhelmed or disappointed with the what's going on around them today, and so I think, you take the vinyl revival, for example. I mean, the fact that, you could only get sort of 20 minutes of music, you could only get that on a piece of vinyl, and then it had to be in a 12-inch sleeve, which meant it had artwork on it and it had lyrics and credits and so on, makes it like a rare gem to a millennial or a Gen Xer who has got, a stream with all the music in the world available at the drop of a hat. The idea that you can clutch in your hands, this sort of precious thing, it is very warming, I think, for a lot of people today. But I think that it's quite easy to have rose-colored spectacles about the past. And so I think it's important not to sort of whitewash that, when you start writing memoirs and stuff like that. You have to dig in the dirt a little bit.
Don't go away. Just time for me to ask you to like, subscribe, comment, and go to popthehistorymakers.com, where you can find all the interviews. There's a drop-down menu. Okay, let's get back to Thomas Dolby. I always think that the getting lost moments in life, whatever they can be completely over the top, but the getting lost moments in life are where you find the essence of who you are. And that can be really interesting.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's certainly true. And, because I don't really write songs these days, I think sort of now with a bit of distance from songs that I wrote in previous decades, to revisit them on stage and sort of unpack them, it's a very sort of communion-like experience for me with hardcore fans that have sort of grown up with these songs, where they've been the soundtrack for their lives. And so there's a very sort of welcoming feeling, I think, that happens at my gigs, and I'm delighted really that they, that the audience that come love the music, and they seem to like me as a person. And that, again, this back to the anxious kid, it's like, well, if you have social anxiety, your big worry is, well, nobody's going to like me. So I suppose it's, that's why it's such a good feeling for me to go back out on tour today.
But that is the wound, isn't it? And that is the compensation for the wound, which is what I feel that all art is, what artists are trying to achieve, in a sense, and that keeps you moving.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's certainly right. Yeah.
Did creating Thomas Dolby free you or constrict you then?
Well, it freed me initially, because I'm not from a showbiz family. I mean, we were not performers. I would always be a little bit apologetic when my family would talk about, they listened to my record or they saw me on TV or whatever, so I'm a bit of a prude like that. And so in a way, to create this persona definitely allowed me to escape. But did it constrict me? No, not really. Because the thing is about that whole period was that my music is not mainstream music. It's not sort of pop culture fodder, really. It's quite niche. I mean, it's very niche, actually. And so I think for that reason, the fact that I got the springboard of a lot of commercial success, early in my 20s, led a lot of listeners to the deeper cuts in my music. And that's what they really got their teeth into, so it's like, my hardcore fans don't ask for Hyperactive and She Blinded Me with Science. They ask for Screen Kiss and Mulu the Rainforest and I Love You Goodbye and Oceaneer, and the sort of the true deep cuts. Those are the ones that they're absolutely thrilling for.
I mean, it's also doesn't alienate. It's not so out there experimental that it alienates people. So I just wondered if there's some form of limitation in your head of, how far you can go, or where you can take your audience.
Well, I mean, they've come along for the ride this far, and I've taken a lot of twists and turns. I mean, I think the people don't talk about this very much, but I think the sort of scope of my limited, I've not a huge repertoire. It's like 4 or 5 albums, but the musical styles within those albums is really a big spread. And I can't actually think of other artists that have that much of a spread, in a relatively small repertoire. So I'm kind of amazed in some ways that anybody has stuck with it, because you'd think that I would have gradually alienated one portion of the audience or another, by venturing into, funk or slightly jazzy stuff, or into, Americana on the last album, whatever. But they seem to go along with it. I'm most musical styles I'm sort of disappointed in. And what I try and do when I use a new musical idiom like that is to sort of create, well, I would like country music if it just sounded like this. I would like jazz if it just sounded like this, and so maybe my audience goes along with it and they say, yeah, I wouldn't normally listen to this kind of stuff, but Thomas is our ambassador, if you like, to bridge that gap.
I mean, you mentioned earlier about orchestras and how they sort of ebb and flow together in unison, and you're working on a symphonic work. What can we expect from that? And how does that relate to how you were talking about how an orchestra works for you?
When I program synthesizers and samplers, and when I produce, I am effectively sort of creating symphonic arrangements, and not because of the instruments that I'm using, but because of the counterpoint, because of the layering and the planing and the colors and tones that I'm selecting. A lot of people that use synths and drum machines and samplers, the machines have a certain purity and stubbornness about the way they work and the way they sound. And there are a lot of electronic acts that were my contemporaries really leaned into that, like Kraftwerk, for example, are just enamored with the purity of the machine, right? And I think that inspired, like a chain of people to do on Bowie and Eno when they went to Berlin, and then Gary Numan and the Human League and Soft Cell and so on in the early 80s through to the sort of EDM dance people. And there's a certain reverence for the way machines naturally play music. I was always fighting that. I mean, occasionally I dipped into it, but mostly I was fighting it and trying to make machines not sound like machines, but sound more orchestral, more cinematic, more atmospheric. And so I suppose what has kept me from doing a lot of symphonic music in the past was, lack of theory or knowledge or the availability. But since I've been teaching at a conservatory, it's really in my face. I'm surrounded by orchestral musicians all the time. I'm very friendly with the symphony there, with the Baltimore Symphony, and I seem to have connected with other former rock musicians who have got into symphonic works. People like Hans Zimmer and Danny Elfman, Trent Reznor, Kip Winger is another guy that is amazing, writing incredible symphonies now. And I think we all have this fascination with it, and dive into it without feeling restricted by the lack of conventional training.
You mentioned Bowie there, and the influence. I mean, so many influences on Bowie, and I think maybe that's a really interesting point, because when I was a 13-year-old, Bowie was about image and about belonging for me. But you look deeper, and it was about German expressionism. It was about Kraftwerk. It was about Genet, Burroughs. It was about Colin Wilson's book, The Outsider. And, it was about theatre, mime. It was so many different elements to what generated Bowie. And I just wonder, in that sense, for you, how important was Bowie or anybody else, for discovering this whole wide berth of every influence that can go into, music, lyrics, everything you want to express?
I was aware that he had absorbed all of those elements, into his image and into his music. But I was never sort of academic enough to go searching through all those citations and thinking, well, I'll read The Outsider, or I'll check out, Kurt Weill or anything like that. I was obviously, Bowie was a huge influence, and shocking and inspiring, but in a day, in an era when you couldn't wait to get the next copy of Melody Maker that was going to have the interview and the new photo session in it, to see what he was talking about and what he was wearing. And so again, it's sort of back to the precious rarefied air of the 70s and 80s. TV shows that would leave you on a cliffhanger and you couldn't find out what happened till the same time next week. I mean, extraordinary. Or a movie that if you missed it in the cinemas, you'd have to wait and hope that it showed up in a revival years later. I can remember Bowie saying one time, they asked what he most wanted in the world, and he said a personal copy of Eraserhead, because Eraserhead had come and gone and he'd seen it and loved it, but he wasn't able to see it again until it, started showing up in art house theaters, years later. So it's just a very special time, really, where you were so grateful to have, in your hands those precious things.
And today, obviously, everything is at our fingertips, which I'm incredibly grateful for. But you talked about streaming, and you can listen to any music you want to listen to online, but often you need people who can point you to things.
Yeah, you do. I mean, you need tastemakers, and you need trusted sources of information that can point you in the right direction. Because otherwise, you just start death scrolling, and you allow the algorithm to determine what you get exposed to. The thing is, though, about progress is that you can't moan about it and sort of say, oh, it was better back in the day. It is what it is, and we're not going to be able to put the brakes on. So what I always try and do is sort of view it as a glass half full and think, okay, but what if? Just come back to that. It's like it starts to make me think about something completely different, and I'd much rather spend my energy going down that rabbit hole than getting waxing lyrical about how good things used to be.
I mean, you've worked with some really amazing artists, and someone like Joni Mitchell. I just wondered how she understood technology, in the sense, did she see it as some form of liberation or some form of constriction?
I think she was really more into musicians than she was into instruments. I don't. She's a keyboard player, but I don't think she was actually very good with synths. I mean, I did a cover of the Jungle line, and part of the reason for that was that the way that she'd used synthesizers on that, I didn't think was particularly inspiring. I mean, it's early days, yes, but I mean, if you listen to what the Beatles or the Beach Boys did with synths in the 60s and 70s, there's no excuse for her to have a sort of tinny string synth sound. So, yeah, I've always loved her music, and I noticed that she would have, these eras where she would work with the same key musician several times, whether it's Tom Scott, Jaco Pastorius, whatever. And that would sort of inform, a certain batch of her albums. And my dream was to be the next in that succession. But the drawback was that the Fairlight had just come out, and she's very intrigued with that. And her partner, co-producer, Larry Kleiner, just got a hold of a Fairlight, but didn't really know how to use it. So they brought me in to sort of basically show them how to use the Fairlight. The issue really was that, if you go back to the Lego blocks analogy that I used, is that, I tend to sort of build things in layers. And Joni sits down at the piano and plays a two-handed sort of arpeggio thing. And so I would be working on a sound that was designed for just like a 3-note melody, and she'd come over and go, "Ooh, nice sound." She'd sit down and start playing piano on it. She go, let's wipe those other things we did yesterday and put this down. So she said, no, I'm only halfway there. I need to keep stacking these things up. You haven't seen the full picture. No, wipe and you had limited tracks in those days. So she'd say, no, let's just delete that and put this down instead. And I'm like, oh no, so we just missed from that point of view. And it just wasn't really a match made in heaven.
What about Stevie Wonder? Because I always wonder what Stevie Wonder knows about musicianship that other musicians don't. Because he was just such a fantastic, or he's such a fantastic musician.
Well, I mean, he's a conjurer, and there's no doubt that his disability gives him extreme magical powers. I mean, a little known fact about it is, air hockey, like a table, like a pool table, little jets of air coming out, and you use a plastic puck and you try and score goals, right? Stevie Wonder is brilliant at air hockey because his reactions and his sense of his ears and smell and the air moving and so on is ultra. It's like a spidey sense. So he can beat most of his friends and staff. He's got an air hockey table at the studio. He can beat them at air hockey, which is just extraordinary. But if somebody's watching a basketball game, he will sort of mime his imitation of basketball. And it's amazing because he's obviously never seen basketball, but he sort of knows what the basic concept is. But you realize that his relationship to gravity and direction must be so different from ours. And so that sort of explains a lot about his music, really. It's like breathing to him. Another little known fact, I mean, it's probably in his Wikipedia, but recently at a TED conference so I used to do like musical overtures at a TED conference, and I had this band of excellent teenage jazz musicians from Chicago, and I wanted to do all Stevie Wonder, as the intros to these TED sessions. And as I went through his catalog, thinking, oh, there's some real gems in there. Actually, all the songs that you wanted to do were from a period of about 3 albums, a period of about 4 years. So Talking Book, Inner Visions, Fulfilling Us, First Finale, basically. So that had, Sir Duke, it had, a lot of the best tunes that you would really want to use. And outside of that period, in a 40-year career, it was like Ma Chérie Amour, and I Just Called to Say I Love You. And what I found out, which is amazing, was that at the beginning of that purple patch for Stevie, he was driving in a car on the highway, and there's a truck in front, and a 4x4, 2x4 flew off the back of this truck through the windscreen of his car and hit him right in the forehead. And he was in a coma for 10 days. And when he woke up from the coma, he didn't feel the music anymore. He felt like he'd lost the music, and he panicked, and he asked them to bring a clavinet into his hospital room. And as soon as he started playing, he realized that he hadn't lost it. It was still there. But the period of 3 or 4 years after that was when all of the best stuff came from. And those are the songs that we picked for the TED conference.
Your studio,
The Nutmeg of Constellation.
It's parked on land, but today, do you use it? Because I presume you work on a laptop.
Yeah, no, I mean, I always worked on a laptop. It wasn't full of equipment. I would just it was an empty shell and very comfortable inside with a great view, but I would just bring my laptop and a couple of synths in, when I was working. I mean, I also, wrote a book in there. I edited a film in there. I used to use it as a spare room. The kids would use it as a party space. So it wasn't really a full-time studio.
Is there an advantage about working on a laptop and not with the hardware in the studio, or is there a disadvantage?
No, there's a big advantage because, if it's behaving right, when you finish work, like I was working before you called, and I just hit save and close the lid, and they're going to transport it to Manchester. And when I open it, hopefully it's going to come back sounding exactly like I left it. And that's just not true with hardware. I mean, it's just, there's a downside of hardware is there's too many variables. There's too many ways to trip things up.
As a pioneer in electronic music, do you feel that has given you more freedom to be termed that? or is it placed restrictions on you, or don't you give a shit really about how you're termed?
I don't really give a shit. I mean, I don't consider myself a pioneer. I just think I was sort of lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. When I got my first programmable drum machine, which is a massive PPG thing the size of a fridge that had actually been designed to turn Tangerine Dream's light show on and off. It was the only one in the world. And I was sitting there programming a computer terminal, to play drum beats before there were drum machines per se. When I got my Fairlight, there were only about, I think, 8 or 9 of them in the country, in the UK at the time. So you couldn't help but be a pioneer if you were one of the few people that had your hands on that new technology. Not many artists were able to persuade their record companies to let them write and record their own videos. When I went to Silicon Valley and formed my software company, people weren't doing sound. I mean, sound was annoying to computer makers because it would, the guy in the next cubicle would complain that he was trying to do his spreadsheets. There was no sound on computer. They didn't even have speakers, most of them. So at every stage of my career, I've been working in an area where I was really one of the few. So, I mean, if you have a history and a track record like that, you're inevitably going to get considered a pioneer because they go, wow, Dolby was doing that back in, fill in the blank.
I want to get back to the tour because it starts tomorrow, I believe. And because it's this 80s recollections, and you mentioned that you're going to be telling stories as well as obviously your music, which I presume has been also reinvented in a sense for, sort of different new versions, as it were, in a way. How have you got about choosing what you want to present for this tour? And did you have any particular criteria of what you wanted to do?
I don't think there was. So, yeah, I mean, the criteria was this. Next year, I'm going to be performing this with a symphony orchestra. And this is preparation for that. This is workshopping this project. So I'm not an experienced orchestrator. I've written very limited orchestral music in the past. I'm not that experienced as a sort of MC frontman. Obviously before I start a song, I will do some banter and I'll sometimes unpack it, tell a story behind it. But the way that I tell stories in my memoir is not generally the way I do it on stage. But this project is eventually going to fold those in together so that I'm telling my stories, the story of my musical voyage through the decade while the music is playing. So this is something fairly new. There's no real points of reference for how to do this. So I'm just sort of experimenting with it and getting comfortable with the whole medium in preparation for getting it in front of an expensive orchestra next year. I'd rather be making my errors with a bunch of samples than with 65, incredible musicians.
So is that sort of suggesting that this whole tour is also a process that you will be changing and working on this tour as well, throughout the tour?
Well, yeah, to an extent. I mean, that is a bit of a thorny trail right there because, anytime you change something, you introduce new ways to mess things up. It's like I'll get a bright idea and then I'm working on it and somebody will say, doors are open in 5 minutes, Thomas. And it's like, oh shit. And so I'll try and, tweak it, hit save, and I'll only find out whether it worked or not when I start the song, in front of a live audience. So there's a lot of ways to fall flat in your face. But my audience has always been very kind about that stuff. And they know that, if you're on the sort of bleeding edge of technology, there's going to be a few road bumps.
Well, I hope you enjoy the road bumps. Good luck on the tour, Thomas, and thank you for talking to me.
Great talking to you, Steve. Bye.
Thank you.